Lecture 76, Marcel Proust.
For many years, everything about Combray that was not the theatre and drama of my bedtime had ceased to exist for me. When one day in winter, as I returned home, my mother, seeing that I was cold, suggested that I have a little tea. She sent for one of those squat, plump cakes called Petite Madeleine that look as though they have been molded in the grooved valve of a scallop shell. And soon, mechanically, I carried to my lips a spoonful of the tea in which I had let soften a bit of Madeleine. But at the very instant when the mouthful of tea mixed with cake crumbs touched my palate, I quivered, attentive to the extraordinary thing that was happening inside me. A delicious pleasure had invaded me, isolated me, without my having any notion as to its cause. Where could it have come to me from, this powerful joy? And suddenly the memory appeared. The taste was the taste of the little piece of Madeleine which on Sunday mornings at Combray my Aunt Léonie would give me after dipping it in her infusion of tea or lime blossom. And as soon as I had recognized the taste of the Madeleine that my aunt used to give me, immediately the old grey house on the street where her bedroom was came like a stage set to attach itself to the little wing opening onto the garden, and with the house, the town, from morning to night, and in all weathers the square where they sent me before lunch, the streets where I went on errands, the paths we took if the weather was fine. All of this, acquiring form and solidity, emerged, town and gardens alike, from my cup of tea. So ends the first section of the first part of Swann's Way, which is itself the first volume of what may be the longest novel ever written, some 3,000 pages in all. Composed by Marcel Proust over a period of at least 8 years, and published in 7 volumes from 1913 to 1927, the novel as a whole is called in French À la recherche du temps perdu. In the first English translation of this novel, its title was a phrase lifted from a Shakespearean sonnet, Remembrance of Things Past. Less Shakespearean, but much closer to the French original, is the title of the most recent English translation of the novel, In Search of Lost Time. And the process of this search is superbly exemplified by the passage that I've just quoted. Probably the most famous of all passages in Proust's great novel, this long passage on what the narrator draws from the taste of the tea-soaked Madeleine shows the narrator at his most introspective. Up to this point, he's been very much engaged in recalling his childhood visits to the house of his grandparents in the country town of Combray. But what he remembers of this town is hardly more than the house itself, and chiefly what he calls the theatre and drama of my bedtime. Pathologically craving a good-night kiss from his mother before going to bed, he's dismayed when she sends him off one evening without it, because she and his father are occupied with dinner guests. Unable to sleep, he tries to summon his mother from the dinner table by means of a note. When the note fails, he waits for her in the upstairs hallway and waylays her as she comes up to bed. Though she's furious with him, and though she tells him to run along back to his room before his father discovers him, he holds his ground, bravely facing the punishment that he knows is coming. Surprisingly, however, his father turns sympathetic as soon as his mother explains what he's doing up so late. Seeing him so upset, his father asks the boy's mother to stay with him in his room, thus granting him far more than he had expected, far more than he could earn as a reward for any good deed. This particular memory is just one of many attached to Combray in the mind of the narrator, but for many years it was virtually all he remembered of his childhood experiences there. On returning to Paris, where he lived for most of each year with his parents, he forgot everything else about Combray until the winter day on which his mother gave him a cup of tea with a petite Madeleine, a little morsel of cake in the shape of a grooved scallop shell. What happens next takes nearly 3 pages to explain. My quotation drastically condenses them. At first, the narrator has no idea why the taste of the tea-soaked Madeleine thrills him so deeply. Since he cannot find the answer by drinking more of the tea, he can only conclude that the truth he seeks is not in the tea, but in himself. So he embarks on a search for what lurks inside him, hiding within his own memory. We all know what it's like to have a name or a word on the tip of our tongues just beyond the reach of our conscious minds. Typically, the elusive item pops up before us suddenly, sometime after we've tried in vain to think of it, and often when we're thinking of something else. But Proust is describing, or rather reenacting for us, something more complicated. He's recalling a moment when the taste of something, the sensation of something on the palate, turned out to be entrancingly evocative. It held a secret. It wouldn't tell him the secret, but it wouldn't let him go. It kept teasing him with the promise that this particular taste could lead him back into the cave of his past and could ultimately help him see the pictures on the wall of that cave. The narrator's journey into the cave of the mind reminds us that behind this gigantic novel of recollection stands a rich tradition of autobiographical narrative. In previous lectures, we've considered some of the milestones in that tradition, such as Wordsworth's Prelude. At one point in this long, introspective poem, Wordsworth compares himself to someone hanging over the side of a slow-moving boat and trying to see what is on the bottom, deep under the surface of the water, even as his eye is distracted by the lights and reflections dancing on that surface. In Wordsworth's simile, the objects lying deep in the water signify his past. Proust likewise uses the imagery of depth to represent what he sought within himself when the taste of the Madeleine set him off on a journey of self-exploration. He wondered, he says, if the memory attached to this particular taste would rise up from the deepest part of me to reach the clear surface of my consciousness. But Proust goes well beyond paraphrasing Wordsworth. He breaks new ground in the literature of recollection and autobiography by showing us how a material object, or rather how the taste of this object, can gradually lead us back to a visual memory, a picture of the past that is otherwise hidden from us, buried away, irretrievably lost, perdu. Because it very gradually moves from the sensation of tasting back to a memory of seeing, this Proustian journey of self-exploration differs from what we usually mean by recognition. We all know what it means to recognize someone or something that we've seen before, and literature gives us many examples of it. At one point in Dickens's Great Expectations, the grown-up Pip suddenly recognizes Magwitch, a man he has not seen since childhood. In a poem called Tintern Abbey, Wordsworth expresses what he felt on returning to the River Wye, to the Wye Valley after an interval of 5 years. And now, with gleams of half-extinguished thought, with many recognitions dim and faint, the picture of the mind revives again. Literally, physically, actually seeing again a place that he first saw 5 years earlier, Wordsworth immediately recognizes its various features, and this recognition leads in turn to the revival of a picture of the mind, a metaphorical picture of his emotional state at the time of his first visit to the Wye. In other words, the sight of the valley prompts him to remember his earlier self. But in Swann's way, the taste of the Madeleine stirs the narrator for reasons that at first he cannot fathom. He stands on the threshold of a mystery, and he struggles to see what lies beyond it. Only after prolonged meditation on the taste of the Madeleine does he find his way to a picture buried deep in his memory, a picture of the whole town of Cambrai, which he certainly knew in his early childhood. In 1908, when Proust started planning and sketching the immense novel that would make its debut in 1913, he was a fashionable Parisian of middle age who had so far displayed his literary talents but had not yet done anything remarkable with them. Born in the Parisian suburb of Auteuil and raised in Paris, he was the literary equivalent of a hothouse flower. Like Flaubert, he was the son of a distinguished doctor. His father made his name as a champion in the war against cholera and pioneered in the field of epidemiology. But the single most important influence on Proust came from his mother. Born Jean Weil, daughter of a wealthy Jewish Parisian family, she doted on both of her sons, especially the first one, Marcel. Exceptionally sensitive to the value of literature and skilled as a pianist, she and her own mother, Adele Weil, Proust's grandmother, took personal charge of his early education. Besides hiring tutors and arranging piano lessons for him and his brother, she and her mother taught them languages, chiefly German and Latin, and nurtured them on what they thought was the best kind of music and literature. With this kind of encouragement, Marcel quickly learned to love reading. His writing, as well as his social life, began to blossom at the Lycée Condorcet, where he studied from the age of 11 to the age of 18. Besides writing for school magazines, he met a number of other talented young men, including Jacques Bizet, whose mother, Geneviève, warmly befriended the young Proust. At her apartment, he met a number of artists and musicians. In 1886, when she became Madame Émile Strauss, her salon on the Boulevard Haussmann gave the 15-year-old Proust access to a veritable galaxy of Parisian stars, including Sarah Bernhardt, the famous actress, Gabrielle Fauré, the composer, Guy de Maupassant, the writer, and Edgar Degas, the artist. But for Proust, the most important of all the people he met at this salon was a man whose name means nothing at all to us now, Charles Haas. A cultivated aristocrat linked with the court of Napoleon III, the 56-year-old Haas cut an enviably fashionable figure. With his slightly upturned mustache, his large stick-pinned cravat, his perfectly tailored suits, and his charming manners, he personified elegance, or as the French say, chic. He was also the only Jewish member of what was probably the most exclusive club in Paris, the Jockey. Since Proust himself was Jewish on his mother's side, even though he was raised as a Catholic, he might have seen Haas as a master in the art of assimilation. But in any case, Proust studied Haas assiduously. And years later, Charles Haas would become the chief source for the protagonist of Proust's masterwork, Charles Swann. But first, Proust had to serve his literary apprenticeship. After finishing up at the Lycée and spending a short time in the army at Orléans, he studied law at the Sorbonne and earned a degree in philosophy. At the same time, starting at the age of 21, he began to publish sketches, word portraits, and criticism in literary magazines. At age 24, he collected these pieces, added a few others, and thus produced his first book, Pleasures and Days, which appeared in 1896 with a preface by Anatole France, a distinguished writer whom Proust much admired and who went on to win the Nobel Prize. The title of Proust's first book, Pleasures and Days, sounds like a hedonistic twist on the ancient Greek poem by Hesiod titled Works and Days. But if the young Proust chose to masquerade as a dilettante, he was nonetheless hard at work. Shortly before Pleasures and Days appeared, he began writing his first novel, Jean Saintoy. After churning out 1,500 manuscript pages over a period of 8 years, he set it aside, and it remained unpublished during his lifetime. Lacking the wisdom and coherence that distinguished the novel to come, it could not satisfy him. But in such things as the jealousy, sensitivity, and self-absorption of the protagonist, this first novel prefigures the next one. Several major events intervened between 1904, when Proust stopped working on Jean Saintoy, and 1908, when he started work on In Search of Lost Time. In 1905, the death of his mother, the great light of his life, led him to a nervous breakdown. After a brief stay in a nursing home, he moved into number 102 Boulevard Haussmann, where he lived for the next 13 years and where he completed In Search of Lost Time. As a longtime sufferer from asthma who nearly died of it when he was 9 years old, Proust craved the security of enclosed, insulated spaces, which is why he did most of his work in a cork-lined bedroom. The novel that Proust created in that bedroom could be called autobiographical only in the sense that it derives from his recollection of many events in his own life and of many people whom he personally knew. Starting with the narrator, who was several times identified as Marcel, though not in Swann's way, virtually all of the main characters spring from actual figures whom Proust knew. I've already mentioned Charles Haas, the original of Swann. The narrator's mother and grandmother, both affectionately rendered, closely resemble Proust's own. The narrator's uncle Adolphe, who scandalizes the narrator's family by entertaining actresses and coquettes, corresponds to Proust's great-uncle Louis, whose taste in women was likewise adventurous. Swann's daughter Gilberte evokes Marie de Benardacchi, whom Proust met at the age of 15. Like Gilberte and the narrator, she and Proust used to play together on the Champs-Élysées, and just as Gilberte enchants the narrator, Marie was the great love of Proust's schoolboy days. Baron de Charlus, the self-important homosexual aristocrat who first appears in Volume 2 of the series, evokes Count Robert de Montesquieu, whom Proust met in his early 20s, and who became a good friend of the novelist, but was nonetheless dismayed by what Proust made of him in fiction. Robert de Saint-Loup, the young aristocrat who loves to talk about literature and becomes a good friend of the narrator in Volume 2, is modeled on a friend of Proust named the Marquis Louis d'Albufera. And Oriane, the dazzling and elegant Duchesse of Guermantes, star of Parisian society, originates in part from Oriane de Goyon, a beautiful, impeccably aristocratic young woman with whom Proust became briefly infatuated just as he started work on his masterpiece. But what do all these facts tell us about the art of Proust? To know only the real-life characters on whom Proust modeled his own is to know only the raw material that he started with, material that he reworked, recreated, and rewove into the great tapestry of his novel. Take, for instance, the beautiful young woman named Oriane de Goyon. Desperately eager to learn all about her and meet her, Proust thoroughly investigated her genealogical tree. I kid you not. Thoroughly investigated her genealogical tree, and then got himself introduced to her. And what happened? He found her irritating and coquettish, 1,000 times less wonderful, he said, than he had expected. So he gave her name to a creature of his imagination, the sparkling personification of wit and elegance, the cynosure of all eyes in Parisian society. Likewise, he remade the places and episodes of his past. In the town of Combray, he combines two places, the Parisian suburb of Auteuil, where the Proust family often stayed with Marcel's great-uncle Louis, and the little town of Illiers, near Chartres, ancestral home of Marcel's father. As for memorable events, even the famous Madeleine is invented, rolled out, scalloped, and baked in the patisserie of Proust's imagination. What Marcel actually dipped in his tea was a bit of dry toast, and the memory that rose up in him was not of any town, but of morning visits to his grandfather. In turning the bit of toast into a petite Madeleine, Proust creates an object of sensual delicacy within what he calls the severe and pious pleating of the scallop shell. And in replacing the memory of visits to his grandfather with the memory of an entire town, he brilliantly prefigures what immediately follows the episode of the Madeleine, namely a detailed account of life in the imaginary town of Combray. Why should this imaginary town bulk so large in the first volume of a novel about Parisian society? Two reasons. First, Combray is inseparable from the childhood of the narrator, and the novel is as much the story of the narrator's life as it is the story of an urban society. Secondly, the vicinity of Combray offers two walks, two quite different ways of exploring its surroundings. One, we are told, was called the way by swans because we passed in front of Monsieur Swann's estate when we went in that direction. The other, says the narrator, was the Guermantes way, so called because it pointed toward the estate of the Guermantes, which will prove to be the grandest family in the whole novel. As a child, knowing nothing of the Guermantes, the narrator learns only that these two ways are topographically distinct. While Swann's way exemplifies the beauty of a plain, the Guermantes way typifies a river landscape. But what chiefly fascinates the narrator about these two places is that they occupy different parts of his brain, that they signify two destinations that seem to him mutually exclusive. As a child grows up to follow the ways of the world, he will come to know both Swann's way and the Guermantes way. That is, Swann's way of life, especially his love life, and the way in which the Guermantes family uses and abuses its immense social power. Since the Guermantes clan includes the homosexual Baron de Charlus, the novel as a whole will explore the whole world of homosexuality as well as all the pangs and pleasures of heterosexual love. And eventually the two ways will be joined, in a sense, when Swann's daughter Gilberte marries one of the Guermantes clan, namely Robert de Saint-Loup. Thus, just as the memory of the whole town of Combray springs up from the narrator's cup of tea, the whole structure of the novel originates from his meditation on the contrast between two ways of walking from Combray itself. Walking through the novel, however, is no easy task. Starting with Volume 1, Swann's Way, it's more like an arduous journey than a leisurely stroll. But if you're reading Proust for the first time, you can learn a lot about the terrain ahead of you by closely inspecting just the first section of Swann's Way, where the character of Swann himself is so artfully introduced and so carefully linked to the thoughts and feelings of the narrator. The first section of the first volume of Proust's immense novel makes an odd curtain raiser, so strange that it completely turned off one of the publishers to whom Proust submitted it. "I don't see," he wrote, "why a man should take 30 pages to describe how he turns over in bed before he goes to sleep." The first section actually runs to 48 pages in the latest English translation. And I must confess that more than once it has put me to sleep, especially when I've tried reading it in bed, which is exactly what the narrator recalls doing with a book in the opening passage. But after a dozen or more readings of the first section, I can tell you this. It offers far more than a description of a man turning over in bed. It shows you how the mind of the narrator is steeped in the consciousness of time, how the world of his childhood shapes his character, and how he comes to see Swann as a kindred spirit, a man after his own heart. To begin reading Swann's Way receptively, we should first of all recognize that Proust is exploring something we experience every night of our lives, unless we're lucky enough to fall asleep the minute or second our heads hit the pillow and go on sleeping until we have to get up. Let's face it, most of us are not perfect sleepers. Every night of our lives, most of us spend a certain amount of time just lying in bed, letting our thoughts roam where they will. Now and then, inevitably, we tap the inexhaustible well of our memories. In the great final chapter of James Joyce's Ulysses, published 9 years after Swann's Way, Molly Bloom roams backward and forward over the course of her whole life as she lies awake in bed next to her husband, Leopold. In the first section of Swann's Way, the narrator lies in bed, chiefly remembering his childhood sojourns at Combray, and above all, his bedroom there. The very first sentence of the novel disorients us. In French it reads, "Longtemps, je me suis couché de bonne heure." Accurately translated, it means in English, "For a long time, I went to bed early." Oddly enough, this sentence binds together two different ways of thinking about time and action. The phrase, "for a long time," denotes an extended period, weeks or months or even years. But the past tense of went typically signifies a single action occurring at one point in time. And this punctuality is underscored by the word early. So where are we? What's happening here? We're suddenly plunged into the mind of the narrator, whose memory of any one action or moment is always inflected by his memory of others, or shaped by the memory of habitual action. Not what I did on any one night, but what I regularly did night after night as I lay in my bed. In other words, the jerky effect of the sentence itself plunges us into the layers of time that make up the narrator's mental world. The I of the sentence, the narrator, is a grown man reflecting on some earlier period of his adult life. He remembers that he would go to bed early, fall asleep quickly, wake up after half an hour, and then imagine that he was still reading by candlelight even as he identified himself with the world portrayed by the book. But then, realizing that the candle was no longer lit, he would find himself wrapped in an incomprehensible darkness and wondering what time it was. Striking a match to look at his watch, he might see that it was nearly midnight, fall back to sleep, and then perhaps effortlessly return to a period of my early life that had ended forever. For the narrator, however, nothing ends forever. It leaves in the mind an indelible trace that can be retraced in sleep or revisited in reverie as we lie in bed. A sleeping man, he writes, holds in a circle around him the sequence of the hours, the order of the years and worlds. He consults them instinctively as he wakes and reads in a second the point on the earth he occupies, the time that has elapsed before his waking, but their ranks can be mixed up, broken. Sometimes, the narrator tells us, he would wake up to a place that he could not immediately recognize. And since I did not know where I was, I did not even understand in the first moment who I was. He could recover his identity only after his body reminded him of the various places where he had lived and the beds in which he had slept, going back to his bedroom in the house of his grandfather in the country town of Combray. As he lay in bed, unsleeping, the memory of his bedroom at Combray would sometimes give way to memories of his bedroom at another country house that he visited years later when he was a young man. But in this first section of the book, the memory of his bedroom at Combray trumps all others. And as we have already seen, what he remembers most about that bedroom is the desperation of waiting for his mother's goodnight kiss. Sent up to bed before his elders sat down to dinner, he would wait for his mother to come up and kiss him once he was in bed. Since she did not come when there was company for dinner, and since company usually consisted of Swan all by himself, we might expect the narrator to have resented Swan. Instead, he juxtaposes two contrasting pictures of Swan. One is the man he first knew as the guest of his parents and grandparents at Combray and in Paris. This family friend was witty but also self-deprecating and apparently inconsequential, a stockbroker's son, predestined to live out his life in the sphere occupied by his father. The other Swan is the man the narrator came to know later, the Swan unknown to the narrator's elders. At the very time they were taking him for a man of no particular importance, no particular social importance, he had in fact already ascended far above his father's social sphere. His wit and charm and impeccable refinement had made him, we are told, one of the most elegant members of the Jockey Club, a favorite friend of the Comte de Paris and the Prince of Wales, one of the men most sought after by the high society of the Faubourg Saint-Germain. Given his grown-up knowledge of the two contrasting Swans, the narrator playfully recalls how little his elders understood this remarkable man, how disapprovingly they clucked over his marrying a woman of the lowest social station, practically a cocotte, and how readily they misread any evidence of his consorting with marquises and dukes. More importantly, the Swan whom the grown-up narrator comes to know is precisely the kind of man who would understand a little boy's desperate longing for a kiss from his mother when she dines with company. When the boy sends her a note begging her to come and see him, he imagines that Swan might have laughed at such a note if he ever saw it. But the narrator later learns that Swan himself knows only too well the anguish of trying in vain to communicate with the object of one's love when she is amusing herself with other people. So in this opening section of the novel, Swan emerges as a man of many sides. He is not just witty, elegant, and beloved in the highest circles, while grossly underestimated by the narrator's elders. He's also a man of deep sensitivity and sympathy, which is what will endear him to the narrator, even as it sharply distinguishes him from the grand family of the Guermantes. As he grows up, the narrator comes to know both of the ways signified by his Combray walks, Swan's way and the Guermantes way. Only after he knows them both and comes to see their failings, along with their considerable charms, can he truly learn the lessons taught by time.